In last week's episode, we talked about the end of history and also the end of the world, but not really the end of either of those things. The end of things that, if you're a philosopher, you could conceivably claim those things. Anyway, let's see what you had to say. Pushdos on the subreddit points out that this episode got some traction on our philosophy on Reddit, which, I mean, I haven't had a chance to check it out fully. I just noticed it about an hour before we started shooting, but there's a lot there, and it all seems really interesting. So go check out the conversation on our philosophy. Looks super great. Dabo100, in talking about their opinion of Francis Fukuyama, which is not a positive one, provides some context that was left out of the episode, sort of on purpose, which is that Fukuyama is a bit of a, let's call him, controversial figure. Which is not to say that Baudrillard and Morton aren't in some way, but Fukuyama maybe more so, and that there are a lot of people who really dislike the way that he approached this idea about the end of history and the way that he approaches all kinds of things like ideology and the function of markets and, all of this other stuff. And I think that this is a really sort of important thing to get into after you've confronted his idea about the end of history on its own merits, and then to sort of deep dive a little bit further into how he justifies it, how he sees the world as working, all this other stuff. Because I think this idea is often misunderstood, and that the arguments that you can make about how he arrives at it and what he thinks the result of it will be, sort of color how it's received a lot of the time. But yeah, this is sort of worth pointing out that one, Fukuyama is his ideas tend to be a little controversial depending upon who you ask, and also very Western oriented, which is something that I think we're going to see a couple times throughout this comment response. Andre Bothma writes a comment that I think introduces some ideas that are helpful in discussing why these particular concepts about history and the world and what they are important and maybe interesting. And what Andre says is that it is maybe not the world that is ending, but it is the world as we know it. And there is a familiarity that we have with this relationship to the rock that we're on, and that as that comes to an end, we sort of reach a point where we have to rely on other things. We can no longer rely on the world as we have come to understand it. We have to rely on something more ephemeral, human ingenuity, creativity, something. You just can't wait for stuff to bubble up out of the ground or fall from the sky to continue the history of humanity. We actually have to work at it. And I think that the reason this is interesting and helpful is because I think understandably there is a lot of resistance to, hold on, I want to make sure I get this right, as Aelolul, and Gabriel Bryant pointed out that what's the deal with philosophers just redefining words and calling things what they aren't. And I think that what they're trying to do is not necessarily to redefine words, but to figure out what those things are as we know them, and as we use those concepts in everyday life. And I think that I can understand a frustration in, history. You're like, okay, well, I know history. I studied it in high school. It's the study of past events as they have occurred and been recorded. So to say then that history is, strictly speaking, the progression of things and an ideological progression as opposed to an event-related progression seems strange. But I think it's also equally as strange to just say that is progress, because progress itself has its own kind of baggage. And so a lot of times in philosophy, you struggle with what the sort of surface level dictionary definition or empirical understanding of an idea is, and the sort of deeper, very layered, very nuanced, beyond the scope of dictionary and encyclopedia meaning of something is, to sort of get down into the depths of it and to figure out what it actually is and how it actually works on this really atomic level. And I think that, what Andre sort of gets at, maybe even sort of, accidentally, sorry if I'm putting words in your mouth, Andre, is that, what we're talking about is things as we know them, which is maybe weirdly slightly different from things as we talk about them. Just though, to be super clear, I'm sort of on board with Joseph Corridon. I do think that Morton is, in a lot of ways, full of it. I mean, you know, I have a sort of love-hate relationship with object-oriented ontology. I think some of Morton's ideas are really useful and very interesting. But I do think it is accurate to say that occasionally he is full of it. Aside from the obvious inanity of KSJDbv, whatever, their comment about liberalism being a mental disorder, I want to point out that Dustin Rodriguez, in the top voted comment on the episode, points out that there was maybe some missing context, which is that when we talk about liberal democracy, we're not talking about the way Americans understand liberalism, as in like the opposite of, say, you know, the Republicans. We mean in the grander sort of historical political theory sense, in that you know, the worth of a human being as an independent actor is in some way more valuable than other ways of thinking about the construction of society, and that we are, when we say, like, when Fukuyama, for example, says that liberal democracy is the thing that we have decided is perhaps the ideal way of governing people, he's not talking, and we by extension are not talking about a leftist democracy. We're talking about something completely different. Maybe we should have explained that, sorry. Jake, essentially, yes, and if I remember correctly, this is something that Morton talks about in his book, that Oppenheimer, was actually part of the process where he destroyed a world. So that's heavy stuff. Zora58 talks about how anything that you might in the recent past have characterized as the end of history should really just be looked at as a kind of temporary stability, and that, you know, you can look at past civilizations and see periods of time where they were relatively stable and maybe themselves thought that they had reached a kind of ending point, that they had figured out society and that everything was working, and, you know, it's the end. We're just gonna do this for forever and everything's fine. And I think it's worth pointing out that this is an idea that Fukuyama himself incorporated into a lot of his later work, and that there's this great piece that's on Aeon, or Eon, which is a great magazine / website if you don't read it, where they talk to him about his sense of what happens when you get to those places of stability. And he had actually said that contrary to how a lot of people understood his idea about the end of history, he was not saying that it was, in fact, all, you know, peaches and cream, raspberries and roses, chicken and waffles, I guess. And that when you get to those places of stability, you end up sort of a byproduct of that is a group of people who will work against that stability and work against that halcyon period for their own gain. And I just want to read a passage from the article, which I think is really good. Talking about some of his later works, they write, Fukuyama was here looking to a future that still lies beyond our present, although we might be taking the first steps toward it. His was a grim warning that if overly recognition-thirsty individuals lived in a world characterized by peaceful and prosperous liberal democracy, then they will struggle against that peace and prosperity and against democracy. More starkly, modern thought raises no barriers to a future nihilistic war against liberal democracy on the part of those brought up in its bosom. So those last two parts are quotes from his work. And I just think, yeah, this is a sort of thought that he eventually settles on, which I think is an important one. Adamkranz states another common and I think justified criticism of Fukuyama, Baudrillard, and Morton, and one that I hold, which is that in maybe or seemingly attempting to be melodramatic, which, you know, sort of like Baudrillard's bread and butter, really, they will tend to pen ideas that require some strange justification and maybe require a recasting of the past or a kind of description of the state of things that works against how those things have been understood up until the point they are writing. And so then sort of work against the understanding of their own work. And I think that that's fair. I think that there's a lot to be said about writing and thought and theory and philosophy that doesn't work against the grain. I think there's a lot to be said about that kind of work that does work against the grain. But I just want to say that I think this is a fair criticism. And what I want to say is that I think that a lot of times the importance of this kind of work that is this kind of difficult and that has this kind of melodrama about it is that it itself is usually sort of trying to do this kind of difficult work to find itself and to find its place in the world and to sort of describe the metaphysical state of things. It's like sort of wandering around in a darkened room, attempting to, you know, sort of bump into things to get a layout of the state of, you know, things that are incapable of actually being seen directly. And I think in the process, you know, you might end up describing things less than accurately, but you still end up sort of getting a sense of how, if the lights were on, things might work. And this is just sort of a way of standing in the middle of this darkened room and spinning around violently, just trying to hit things to see what you bump into. And that's how I like to think about this kind of work, and that it is, I think, a lot of times less methodical than other kinds of work, and less inviting and safe, but still has a value kind of almost because of its, I don't know, for lack of a better word, maybe insanity or just intensity. So yeah, that's why I think this kind of thing is worth appraising.